is adopt English now because we're moving into a communication in English, paper in English, from Pascal de Decker, who comes to us from Antwerp University, no, Leuven University. Previously Antwerp, previously Ghent.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I'm reading the bits of information on my own. And who is a sociologist and of urban planning. And we will be speaking today about utopia beaten by consumers.
So the presentation is, you need a microphone? Presentation is made together with my colleague Caroline Newton, who can't be here today. So I'm a sociologist, Caroline is an architect, and we both have also a degree in urban planning. I work for a School of Architecture in Brussels, and again, so as a sociologist I'm working for a School of Architecture. And Caroline is working at London University. I will have a very general talk with different inputs. One is of course urban planning, the other one is housing sociology, and we are based on, our material is based on, of course, study of literature, but also some qualitative interviews. Caroline did for her PhD in South Africa, and I did in Belgium, France. Okay. Let's say the central question can be summarized as: could modern post-war mass social housing in high-rise version, could it be, in looking backward, could it be sustainable in individualizing society? The thing is, I think we are talking here a lot about France and the Bonluca question in France, but in a lot of countries, high-rise social housing estates have come into trouble and are restructured or demolished at the moment. So it's more about the model presented at a certain period in time. So I will have short tell you something about utopia, and on the rise and fall of it. The meaning of living should be the meaning of housing, to be precisely, and the reading of a modernist neighborhood in an individualized society. First question is, why are we here? And the we refers to me, but also to Caroline. Living in Flanders, Belgium, who is a low-density country with very little social renting. Only 6% of the housing stock is social renting, and also very little high-rise social housing. The why is because we earlier on wrote an article at the fall of utopia in Urban Challenge. It's a Slovenian journal, so for those who know Slovenian, you can also read the Slovenian version. The input, as I said, is literature, international literature on problems in social housing and peripheral estates, the rising stigma on social housing everywhere, and also in Belgium. Our qualitative interviews, residents refer to, I live in a rabbit hutch or a battery cage or a dovecote, so people are very aware of the images that are told about their housing. We see everywhere restructurings of social housing and demolitions. We have made some study tours all over Europe, and we have some debates on the future of social housing. So here is an image of a high-rise estate in the city of Ghent. Flanders, one of the few who is on the demolition list, so they are emptying the building now, and within a few years they will demolish the building. So introducing utopia, if we have all these high-rise estates surrounding a lot of cities in the Western world, where did that come from? I think there are some reasons to build them just after the Second World War, depending on the city where you are. There were some cities who had severe war damages, for instance in the Netherlands, also Marseille in France. You have the influx somewhat later of migrants in our countries. In France you had bidonvilles and you have rising populations. So the construction, to solve the housing problems at that time, the construction of large estates was one of the techniques to do it. But when time passed by, we saw rising vacancies, decline of the estates, more crime, more marginality, and a lot of them had very bad social indicators. So the policy reaction at the end of that was reconstruction or a demolition. Because I had a quotation already in '74, a Dutch criminologist already said that this kind of architecture creates crime. Architectural and planological accountability and planning alienation. So the people who commit crimes in these neighborhoods should not be condemned because it was the architecture that was the cause of it. It's just a quote. I do not necessarily agree with the quote. So nevertheless, I will blame Le Corbusier at least a little bit. At least when we talk about utopia, it's a quote from Fishman here, that many people dream of a better world. Well, Howard, Wright, and Le Corbusier went a step further and just planned one. As I said, just after the Second World War, governments needed to solve huge housing problems in different places all over the Western world for the common good, as governments should do. At that time, there was a theory developed during the both wars, a theory by Le Corbusier and Hessian. The function was a house should be a machine à habiter, or own food, that's expense minimum. So a very small house just to shelter people. There was a method, we had a rational utilitarian planning of that time to counter the chaotic growth of the previous period, and this was also a social goal, the transformation of man and to create a new society. And there were construction techniques. So you had, on one hand, you had a theory, and on the other hand, you had the possibility to do that. So as a consequence, a lot of governments used mass housing, rational planning, and high-rise estates to solve housing problems of the time. But already in '59, a Dutch architect, Van Eyck, critiqued the woning voor das Existenzminimum, the machine habité, that it would become a new kind of SAC, because the sole interest of the governments at that time were output and not housing quality. Nevertheless, although the critics came on very early, there was a further expansion of CM ideas until, let's say, 1972, and in the United States, the famous private Igloo estate is the first to go down, to be demolished, to be bombed only 20 years after it got constructed. So this brings us, something went wrong, at least with some of these housing estates. It brings us to the meaning of living, especially to the meaning of housing. If you just look at Corbusier, and I'm teaching at the School of Architecture, still a lot of architects believe that they can change the world through architecture and change the man through architecture, and it's debates every day at school, at all place. So Le Corbusier himself thought that architecture and design could enlighten the ordinary man and make them a better world. But nevertheless, he himself was already confronted with realities. He could, in France, I think in Pessac in the 1930s, construct an estate with, based on his ideas. That's a picture on the left, the white house, modern house over there. Nice design. But people could not understand it because, well, they could not understand it. Shortly after they went living in these houses, they start to change everything on it, the colors, the inside arrangement, and things. So the people, there was a confrontation already in the 1930s, and that's a very small project of Le Corbusier between the users and the experts. And this mismatch would become very apparent in high-rise solutions. Now, in looking back, modernist planners had an idea of building societies of the future, the creation of a new man, but in fact they solved the problems of the past. They solved housing problems of the past. They were against the city, the industrial city as it grew. So let's say a good timing became a bad timing, as for these welfare states developed from the 1960s on. What does that mean? Our welfare states developed. That means that the wealth rose spectacularly in most of Western countries, and at the same time social security systems were developed, meaning that people had either money, and when there was problems, there was the state to solve, at least temporarily, their income problems. So at that time, from the 60s on, housing became a lot more than shelter. It became also a consumption good. So the modernist thinking was through the rise of prosperity, modest thinking became reductionist thinking. Yeah? Since very little people already at that time wanted to live in high-rise estates and prefer a freestanding house or a villa. That means if we want to understand why things go wrong in modernist housing, we also have to look at what does for the people who have to live in a house, what does mean housing for them. So that scheme is drawn by my colleague, by Caroline, based on her PhD. So in house and in housing, you should say, you have a lot of meanings are attached to the house. Of course, a house as a physical layer, it's a shelter, it's a basic need. We cannot without that. But as society becomes more prosperous, the other things are becoming more and more important. To the house, a lot of symbolics are attached. They have to do with status, with success, with security, and that kind of stuff. Caroline did especially research on female respondents in South Africa, so she had also attached the whole care issue to the meaning of house. Very important for the house is care for the children, security of the children, and that kind of stuff. And if you then go to look at societies like for instance in Belgium or the US, home ownership is very important. All these symbolical things can be realized. People think, also construction of course, that this can be realized through home ownership. So home ownership is becoming very important. And I put some and read some other words. I've just finishing some research in Flanders, doing qualitative interviews with people in all kinds of suburbs, with the pavilion style, but also the high-rise estates. And all people want from their house is it should be comfortable, and then it should be rest. It's a place to withdraw from the world. It's a place of peace and it's a resting place, and that links housing to the broadest function of the broader social structure. So if we look at the meaning of housing, living, here this is based on Tuan, but a lot of other authors wrote the same thing, that behind their facades, modern buildings do not offer their inhabitants any bodily and sensual pleasure or sensation or smell or touch. It's very important in a country like Belgium, where self-building is very important. Still a lot of Belgian and especially Flemish people construct their home themselves. So, and in high-rise apartments make things worse because the building's outlook make it impossible to take individual homes therein. So low-cost housing and social housing through the high-rise form becomes an undisguised marker of low-cost housing and of a failure in society. So the tenants, and also see if you talk to tenants, tenants also see themselves as inferior. So that makes the symbolic meaning of their housing very important. From our own interviews, what we see, on the one hand, people are very aware of the fact that social housing for them is very good. It's good housing, comfort, space, it's affordable. But nevertheless, they're living, as I said, in a dovecote. They're very aware of the fact that they are living in on the lowest level, spots of the housing ladder. So collective housing, through the kind of society we live in, who's very much pointing to individual success, collective housing is becoming the opposite of a success indicator. Let's say that's one point. So in the kind of society we live in, you have to be successful individually. It's very hard to show that to the world through work. You're either in an office or in a factory or doing something. So you use other indicators to show to the world that you are also successful in that world. And one of the means is through your housing. And if you are in social housing, it's really an indicator of being an unsuccessful person. In the Belgian case, when social housing started 100 years ago, it was already the distinction between the deserving and the non-deserving poor, and it has been repeated ever and ever again. So let's say that's a very kind of reasoning. We have to be successful in our society. We can show that through our housing. and collective housing does not show that. It's linked to the economy of our society, political economy of our society. But Peter Dickens, who's also a sociologist, who takes it even a step further, he says people are not slavishly following an individual ideology. They really need, in the end, a place for themselves. It's a psychological or biological need to have a place for themselves that gives them safety and security, and a place to make them free from the rest of the world. So for him, and then in the construction society, especially Belgium, where home ownership is the goal, that's a construction in a society where home ownership always being individualized housing, is a matter of success. It's not a false need to long for an own house. And then taking it a step further, if say home ownership is important in society to be successful, and people accept that, then collective ownership is just the opposite. It's a symbol of social failure. So we should not be, if that's functioning, if your society is functioning that way, we should not be surprised that people move out as soon as they can, and that people who are moving in are people who are low on the social ladder, who are less income, who are problematic, who have social problems, private problems, and that kind of stuff. In Belgium, we see that the small share of proper housing, of social housing now, is very rapidly marginalizing. Concentration, single family households, single mothers with children, singles, elderly, people coming from abroad. So it's really, we're somewhat later than in other countries, but it's coming in our country through with, as I showed the picture, the demolition of some estates is on the list. So, and also that's going back to the modernist, to the architects, the modernist architects. One of the comments when it became aware that mass social housing was not doing very well in general terms, one of the comments of an architect, Christopher James, an architect critic, was that the poor are not the nuanced and sophisticated readers of architectural space the educated architects were. So the problems was not the architecture, but were the people. I think people, and it shows, qualitative research shows that over and over again, that people are well aware, that people can read these buildings very well. They define them themselves as a kind of urban reserve, as a warehouse, prison-like. So in fact, it's the modernistic urban, and looking back, modernistic urban planners and architects neglected the fact that people are very well aware of their position in society, and as a consequence can read very well the position of their housing in society as such. Okay, thank you.